Good morning, folks. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm good. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Once again, I hope you had a nice Thanksgiving break. And of course, we're trying to wrap up our semester in the next 2 weeks. So, looking at the syllabus here, believe it or not, it is December 1st today. We have 3 lectures, including today. Next week is our third and final laboratory exam of the semester. And of course, you know about your final exam at this point. Your final exam for this course is Wednesday, December 15th at 8 a.m. Wednesday, December 15th at 8 a.m. is your final exam. So some busy times, and then we'll get some rest after that. Do you have any questions right now in regards to our schedule or finishing up the semester? Okay. All right. So folks, what we're going to do is hit chapter 15 hard today. I anticipate spilling over into lab time to finish the coverage of chapter 15. Because next week on Monday, we need to start chapter 16, okay? So we're just gonna rock and roll here, and let's see how far we can get. I'm gonna share my screen with you. At the end of last class, this is where we were. We had started chapter 15, and I generated this table where we compared the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. So, just to start your thinking again, remember, somatic nervous system basically coordinates and regulates the contraction of skeletal muscle tissue. Autonomic nervous system coordinates and regulates the contraction of smooth muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue of the heart, and the ejection of substances from your glandular tissues of both the exocrine and endocrine systems, okay? So we had put a couple questions into your notes from last time, and I'll just remind you of these. The first one was, how can the same neurotransmitter produce a different response at different locations of the body? And the answer is that the body makes different receptors that combine to the same hormone. Different receptors respond to the same hormone differently. So some receptors will produce an excitatory response that will produce depolarization in a neuron. Other receptors, when they bind the same neurotransmitter, will actually have an inhibitory response where they hyperpolarize the membrane of the neuron. Second question, what is a ganglion? It's a group of neuronal cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. And third, what is the purpose of a ganglion? We said to allow information from a single presynaptic neuron to be spread across multiple postsynaptic neurons that are moving to different target locations in the body. Okay, and I use the analogy of gossip, right? If someone's gossiping, does the gossip spread faster if one person is talking to 2 people or one person is talking to 10 people? Obviously, if the gossip is between one person and a group of 10, you're gonna spread that gossip more rapidly. So there is a lot of content in chapter 15, and I dare say I don't think I can honestly give you notes on every page of chapter 15. It's just too much. So what I'm going to do is try to give you the big ideas by going through an analogy with you, okay, to talk about the topics and the major themes of chapter 15. So let's get started with this. What I want to do is try to provide you a practical example of the content of this chapter, where we talk about the physiology of the body, particularly as is relevant for chapter 15. And so the major example topic here is going to be a question. How does your body, how does our body respond when it is scared, okay? So how does your body respond when you are scared. That's our talking point here. We're going to use this and talk about the fight or flight response and what happens after the fight or flight response in terms of chapter 15 content. Okay, so let me make a couple points here and then we'll get started picking this apart. First off, you appreciate that when you are scared, your body responds by activating the fight or flight response. Basically, every health class in high school, I think, probably talks about fight or flight because it's a common theme covered in high school curricula. So when you are scared, your body responds by activating the fight or flight response. And you know from previous notes that fight or flight response is largely going to be handled by the sympathetic subdivision of the autonomic nervous system, right? You know that because we've talked about it and we've documented it several times. Sympathetic nervous system is a subdivision of the autonomic nervous system responsible for fight or flight. Okay, and I think all of us have experienced the adrenaline rush, if you will, of being scared from various times in our life, whether we did that intentionally by going on a roller coaster, or whether you had truly a terrifying experience where somebody, God forbid, somebody was robbing you in your home or something like that. Whatever it was, we've all experienced fear at different times. I will also mention to you that we are also going to make an attempt with our time here together to describe what happens after the fear has passed, after it has dissipated, after the initial threat has gone away or been resolved in some way. What does your body do? Well, obviously your body calms down. So that's going to be the rest and digest response, which is handled by the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so after the threat that caused you to be afraid, after the threat that caused you to feel fear has passed, then your rest and digest branch of the nervous system is going to activate. Okay, so for purposes of understanding content, we human beings, all of us, myself included, right, we have to kind of take pieces of information and compartmentalize it so that we have some chance of understanding complicated things, right? And what I'm saying is that even though we're going to talk about fight or flight, and then we're going to talk about the after effect of rest and digest, please know that there are times when these things are experiencing crosstalk, cross communication. So there's not a real compartmentalization in the body as we might artificially give you that sense when we're having a conversation. Okay. Now the physiological changes that take place during fight or flight is going to be handled by a combination of nervous system activation and hormonal release from endocrine tissue. Physiological responses that take place during fight or flight are orchestrated by, number one, nervous system activation, and two, endocrine tissue activation. Okay. So when we talk about command and control anatomy, when we talk about command and control anatomy of your entire body, the master command and control anatomy is the nervous system. The nervous system sits at the top of our umbrella that describes command and control infrastructure of the body. Nervous system is it. It is the head honcho. But a little bit underneath the nervous system is the endocrine system and all the organs and tissues of those organs that contain glandular tissues that are capable of manufacturing and releasing hormones. They play a very close second position in the command and control hierarchy. Okay, so we're actually not going to talk about the endocrine system in any great detail here in AMP1. You will get that in AMP2, but please understand and keep it in your mind as you go through your entire curriculum that when you talk command and control, the head honcho is the nervous system, and the first lieutenant is the endocrine system. Okay, so let me ask you to help me out in the chat window. Let me put a question or a request in the chat window. Here we go. Please describe what happens to your body during a fear response. What do you experience, folks? Just give me a list of things that you remember feeling the last time you were scared. How did you feel? Okay, let's get a list of these things here. Okay, just keep contributing, folks. I really appreciate it. I'm going to document the things that you put in the chat window. Okay, so all right, so let's see here. Okay, yeah, rapid heartbeat, right? Rapid heartbeat. So increased heart rate, absolutely. You might shake, so trembling. You might sweat, absolutely. Okay. Shakiness or trembling. Obviously, if you're shaking or trembling, that's going to involve muscle activation, is it not? You're going to probably sweat. Okay. Okay. Rapid breathing, your breathing increases. Right. Okay. All right. Sweating. Okay. You may, in fact, get some goosebumps. Absolutely. So we know that's going to be due to the smooth muscle tissue around your hair follicles and the dermal layer of your skin. You might have a sense of anxiety. Okay, so there's some emotion there. Okay, you might have, typically, during stressful events, the rational, logical part of your brain kind of goes out the window, doesn't it? You just start to panic a little bit, right? You seem to lose the ability for logical thought in the moment. Okay. Okay. Momentarily lose rational thought. Okay. You might have hair standing on the ends. Okay. Okay. All right, folks, good list. Thank you so much for contributing there. I really appreciate it. I would agree with every one of the things that you put in your notes, that we put in your notes here. And let me just clean this up a little bit. And what I'm going to do is add a couple things that that you may not be aware of. Okay, so everything you gave me is good stuff. Thank you for contributing this morning. I really appreciate it. Let me tell you some other things. When you are scared, you are going to see a spike in your blood glucose level. When you're scared, your blood glucose level spikes tremendously. Okay. Think about that. When you're scared, there's going to be a dump of glucose into the bloodstream from organs and tissues that are holding on to glucose, like the liver. Okay, it's going to dump glucose into the bloodstream because the glucose is going to circulate around to the body and make sure that all the tissues, particularly all the tissues that need to engage during fight or flight, like the skeletal muscle, is going to have plenty of biochemical fuel to contract and potentially move us out of the way of the threat, right? We can run away from the threat. So your blood glucose level is going to go up. Also, many of you put in the fact that you're going to have increased heart rate. Increased heart rate is in part going to boost your blood pressure, but in addition to that, the smooth muscle tissue around your peripheral blood vessels is going to constrict, right? You've probably heard before that during stressful times, or during times, which would include, by the way, being outside in the cold weather without any protection, right? Your blood supply is going to centralize in your core, where your major organs are: heart, liver, kidneys, things like that. And your extremities, well, the blood supply is not going to be maintained as much out there because, well, it would, from Mother Nature's logic, it would be better to lose a finger or hand than it would be to have your heart stop beating. Okay, so long story short, blood vessels in the periphery, basically your limbs, are going to constrict, and that's going to help bolster blood pressure in those structures. Okay, peripheral blood vessels constrict. You will also, around the central blood vessels of your internal organs, like lungs, like heart, like kidneys, like liver, like brain, the central blood vessels are actually going to dilate, and that's going to ensure that the major organs have access to warm oxygenated blood. Okay. Central blood vessels dilate. It might also be a shock to you. Well, let me ask you this one. Have you ever felt fear when giving a public speech? And a lot of times people complain about getting a dry mouth, right? Getting a dry mouth. Let's see here. I have a couple more in my notes. During fear, your blood calcium levels will also spike. Okay, think about how many times this semester we've had a conversation about calcium, right? We know that calcium is stored in our bones, but it is homeostatically monitored, measured, and adjusted in the bloodstream, because it's in the bloodstream that you're going to deliver calcium to target organs that need to rely on calcium for function. Muscles require calcium to contract. Neurons require calcium to release neurotransmitter, right? So blood calcium levels are going to spike to ensure that tissues that rely on calcium have an adequate supply of calcium. Okay. And then I'll mention one more. actually, in the first couple days after you have had a fearful event, your white blood cell count will go up, okay? Okay, white blood cell count goes up after a couple of days after the initial event. And you think about white blood cells are your immune system defenders. Your immune system is protecting your body against various threats that could be fearful, right? And so Mother Nature does spike the blood cell count, the white blood cells, after that fear event as a way of trying to protect you, okay? So you can see here, we have quite a long list of responses to fear. And so we can't talk about all of these. There's just not enough time. But first off, it was really good that we could produce this list. And it gives us a way to think about, wow, there are a multitude of different things happening basically simultaneously when we have a fear response. And so we're going to try to conceptualize this in an example of the fear response with fight or flight, okay? So thank you for contributing this morning. Let's continue this practical example of talking about how your body responds when you are afraid. Okay, so here's a hypothetical scenario that I would like us to consider moving forward. Okay. So let me ask you a question in the chat window. Have you ever been to a 4D theater in Philadelphia or Baltimore or anywhere else? Do you know what I mean by a 4D theater? 4D theater would be one where you sit in the theater, and like a traditional movie theater, you see images on the screen in front of you and you hear the audio from the speakers, right? But then traditionally, you know, the theater will be equipped with special chairs. So you're sitting in the chair, and maybe during a critical part of the movie, part of your chair vibrates, or during a critical part of the movie, maybe there's a puff of air pushed onto the back of your neck that startles you, or maybe during a critical part of the movie, they have special equipment in the theater that ejects some kind of fragrance, some kind of perfume that gives some kind of odor. Okay, and the whole point of this 4D movie experience is to make the more experience real and tangible to you, so you start to get into the moment and escape reality a little bit, right? So I would like us to think about a 4D movie experience where we are experiencing sensations that are intended to induce fear. And no, this is a bit of a contrived example, but by doing it this way, we can start talking about specific things and relating them to the topics of chapter 15, okay? So hypothetical scenario, let's say that we are visiting a scary 4D movie, okay? In this movie, or during this movie, we are exposed to the following stimuli. Okay, so during the movie, as I mentioned, you get puffs of cold air blown onto the back of your neck. Okay, While you're in the movie, you're noticing the images on the screen, and it's some kind of scary image. You know, I'm not much into horror movies these days, but so I'll keep it pretty simple. Let's say that there's some kind of scary thing moving towards you. Let's say it's an image of Frankenstein moving towards you, but it's a scary Frankenstein, okay? The movie screen shows Frankenstein moving toward you. Let's say in the background, you have the music from the speakers and you hear the howling of a wolf, a werewolf, okay? Music is streaming from the speakers and you detect the howling of a werewolf, okay? And let's say, we'll do one more thing here. Let's say that the theater is equipped with machinery that can inject a perfume, a fragrance into the room, and it's an uncomfortable fragrance. So, and it's the fragrance of rotting flesh. Okay, rotting flesh. Special equipment ejects a perfume conveying an odor of rotting flesh. Okay, so the whole point here is that all of, any one of these things by themselves would be a little bit unnerving, but if you're experiencing them all simultaneously during a threat event, you're really going to be scared. Okay, that's the point, that all of this stuff is scaring us. Now, if you've gone into a 4D movie, you know what you're putting yourself into, right? You've done that rationally. Obviously, there could be moments in life where something unexpected happens, like God forbid, you're in a car accident, and that's terrifying in the moment, right? It's scary. So Noah's mentioning in the chat window that he's been to a theater where they ejected water onto you. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Noah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's all kinds of things that can be done to bring you into the moment, to escape reality, right? Okay. So the point here is we are scared. The point here of this scenario is that we are scared. So if we think about this scenario, now what I want to do is think about the physiology. Okay. So we're in a 4D movie, we're experiencing all these various stimuli. What is going to happen? Understanding how our body responds in the 4D scary movie. Okay, the first thing that we need to talk about is the input. And what I mean by that is we've told you here the scenario, we need to talk about the input. That means the stimulus, the various types of stimuli. How is that stimuli going to get into your brain so your brain processes it, okay? So the very first thing is input. So this is going to be the sensory nervous system that we're talking about here, okay? And so I'm going to take some of the ideas from the hypothetical scenario and try to connect it to the topics of our textbook. First thing, you are seeing a screen in front of you with Frankenstein coming towards you. Obviously, your eyes are the major pieces of anatomy that are going to handle that, right? So your eyes, which represent anatomy of the quote unquote special senses, of which you're quite expert on right now from the anatomy because you're studying it for your lab exam next week. Okay, your eyes, anatomy of the special senses, delivers information. The information is the photons of light coming off the screen where you know that that's Frankenstein, delivers information via nerve impulses from the retina, the nervous system tissue at the back of the eye, to the brain. And more specifically, I'm not going to go through everything here because it's a little bit of insanity, isn't it, in terms of how complicated this truly is. But the part of the brain that's going to be heavily involved in giving you a logical, rational interpretation of what the image is largely going to be in the occipital lobe of the brain. So in the occipital lobe of the brain, the information that's initially being gathered in the eyeball is being sent the whole way through the internal anatomy of the brain back to the occipital lobe. And in the occipital lobe, that nervous tissue is processing and saying, oh, I'm looking at an image of Frankenstein. Okay, the occipital lobe is not inducing the fear. It's simply saying, oh, I recognize that image. That is Frankenstein. Okay, so let me complete my statement here. Then I'm going to go to visible body and just trace the pathway through there just a little bit. Okay, so your eyes deliver information via nerve impulses from the retina to the brain. It's going to be the occipital lobe. Of the cerebral cortex. And that information is going to come in via the optic nerve, which you've been studying, right? And you may or may not know that the optic nerve is designated as cranial nerve number 2. You don't have to know the numbering of the nerves for your lab exam, so don't worry about that, okay? So via the optical nerve, which is cranial nerve 2, okay? So folks, let me read this and then we'll go to visible body here, okay? Your eyes deliver information via the nerve impulses from the retina to the occipital lobe of the cerebral cortex of your brain, okay? From the retina, it's going to get into the deeper areas of your brain via the optic nerve, okay? And so, the occipital lobe will allow you to recognize Frankenstein, okay? You're going to recognize Frankenstein. You're not going to be scared of Frankenstein because of the processes happening in the occipital lobe. The fear is going to come about a little bit later on, okay? So let me go to visible body here. And what I did before class is I got ourselves set up here with the typical brain anatomy that you're used to seeing, right? So, cerebellum, putamen, the lateral ventricle, all that kind of good stuff, right? The hypothalamus, pituitary gland, amygdala, optic nerve, eyeball, right? All that stuff you're familiar with. Okay, so if I turn it this way, here's what we're looking at. So this is an image of part of your anatomy as you're sitting in the 4D theater, right? So what I'm saying is you're getting photons of light coming off the movie screen. They're entering your eyeball. Those photons of light are photons of light are going through the eye, right? Going through the eye, hitting the retina, generating graded potentials, which will then summate at the axon hillock of the retinal neurons and fire action potentials that then move into the optic nerve. That's what we're talking about in our conversation. And notice that the optic nerve, right, you're going to end up at the optic chiasm, but you're going to pass through nerve fibers that go into the hypothalamus. There are bundles of neurons that are going to branch off into other pathways here at the septal nucleus, okay, and you're going to have additional action potentials along this anatomy that trace along here and get to the hippocampus and to the amygdala. in this anatomy and really not visible in the visible body software. There are going to be tracts of neurons that move back into the occipital lobe where you get your recognition event. Okay, so there's kind of like an injection of information through the eyeball that gets into the hypothalamus, and then it spreads out like a spider web with multiple threads into different anatomical regions of your brain. Back here in the occipital lobe, which I'm highlighting with orange right now, is where you're going to get a recognition event of the fact that, oh, that's Frankenstein. That is Frankenstein. Now remember, all these neurons are connecting to other neurons that move to different subregions of brain anatomy, and those connections are going to be via interneurons. You remember that phrase, interneuron? And we said that interneurons are the most common abundant type of neuron in your nervous system. So interneurons are bridging neurons. So neurons of the optic nerve are going to bridge with other neurons that then go in the indusium griseum, going to bridge with other neurons that pass through the brain structure into the occipital lobe. There's going to be a connectedness of electrical impulses that spread out through a network of neuronal fibers that are connected neuron to interneuron to another neuron to another interneuron in a piggybacking way like this. We are only truly at the cusp of beginning to understand this stuff from a scientific perspective. But once again, you're seeing Frankenstein, the light's coming into your eyeball, coming in the optic nerve through the hypothalamus, and then spreading out to different brain regions. You're going to get logical appreciation of Frankenstein in the back occipital lobe. And then the other thing I wanted to show you is there's going to be all kinds of nerve fibers communicating back out of the occipital lobe, back into basically the area of your brain that's called the limbic system. Okay, so if I rotate this, all of a sudden my my drawing doesn't make sense anymore. So I'm gonna clear the drawing and mention to you that, right, you know, the hippocampus is very important with memory formation and things like that. And basically what I want to do is show you the anatomy of your limbic system. Okay, so everything color coded blue right now is anatomy of the nervous system. And what I'm trying to tell you is that as the information of Frankenstein gets processed into the occipital lobe and up the cingulate gyrus and the inducing greasing, there's going to be a lot of massive crosstalk from various regions of the brain. The recognition of Frankenstein is going to crosstalk into the anatomy of the limbic system. And basically, the anatomy of the limbic system is responsible for memory and emotional responses. Memory and emotional responses. So this anatomy that's color-coded blue right now on both the left and right hemispheres of the brain is going to be the region of anatomy where you take the logical realization that you're seeing Frankenstein and connect it with emotion and memory, which is stored and processed in the limbic system anatomy. So once the realization of Frankenstein is achieved in the occipital lobe, the limbic system anatomy is going to layer on top of that rational conclusion fear. Oh my goodness, I should be afraid because this is Frankenstein. Now, obviously, if this is a silly 4D theater, you might not come to a fear response because it might be Frankenstein walking around in a clown costume, right? Or it might be a legitimate horror style Frankenstein where the emotional intensity of the image is realized through the synaptic connections of the limbic system anatomy. Okay. So that's about as best as we can currently do from a medical perspective to understand this. And I certainly would not expect anything deeper from you on an exam. Okay, so limbic system anatomy, memory and emotion. Occipital lobe, in terms of our 4D scary movie, a rational conclusion that what you're looking at is Frankenstein. It all started with the eye, came up the optic nerve and passed through the hypothalamus. And I point that out because the hypothalamus is basically your relay center between the nervous system and the endocrine system, right here. Okay, so this here is going to be involved with sending neuronal information out to endocrine tissue. After your limbic system decides that you should be afraid, the hypothalamus is going to send action potentials down to various glandular tissues to release things like adrenaline. Okay, so all of a sudden you're releasing adrenaline, and oh my goodness, all of a sudden your heart rate's going up. Okay. Okay. So any thoughts or questions right now? You know, this is one of many reasons why anatomy and physiology is so hard, right? Because we got to try to connect the dots between the anatomy and the physiological responses that we are experiencing and observing. Okay, so let's continue here. So your eyes are sending nerve impulses via the optic nerve to the occipital lobe of the brain, where you're realizing that you're looking at Frankenstein. Next, number 2, your ears. Your ears are going to receive auditory information, right? Your ears, which is anatomy of the special senses, delivers information, again, via nerve impulses, right? I won't keep repeating that, but you appreciate the information I'm talking about is the electrical signals. So it delivers information from the cochlea, which you are also aware of because of your time studying the anatomy in lab, from the cochlea in the inner ear to the brain. The region of the brain that's primarily going to process the auditory information is the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe of the cerebral cortex. Okay. And that is going to be via the vestibulocochlear nerve, right? The vestibulocochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve 8. Okay, so I'm not gonna take time to trace out everything with visible body, but I did want to do it once with the eyeballs. But you folks know where the temporal lobe is, right? You know where your ears are. You're studying the anatomy of the inner ear. You know where the cochlea is at this point. Okay, so when sound waves from the speakers bounce off your eardrum vibrates. The mechanical motion of the eardrum disturbs those 3 little tiny bones inside your middle ear, the incus, stapes, and anvil, right? And when those tiny 3 little bones move, they push up against the opening of the cochlea called the oval window. And when they do that, they act as sort of a plunger, which sloshes liquid around like a piston in a wave pool at Dorney Park, sloshing the liquid around inside the cochlea. When you slosh the liquid around inside the cochlea, basically you agitate the motion of hair fibers that are connected to neurons that are part of the cochlear nerve. That generates a graded potential, which summates to an action potential, which then sends the information to the temporal lobe. And it's in the temporal lobe that you're going to have a rational awareness of, oh, I hear a wolf howling. Okay. So let me document the statement I made about the limbic system. Okay, remember that the limbic system anatomy, which you know several pieces of it through your word bank, will overlay your rational thought processes with memory and emotion. Okay, so let me read my notes here. Number 2, your ears deliver information from the cochlea to the brain, the temporal lobe specifically, via the vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay, so here you will rationally realize that you are hearing the sound of a wolf. Okay, and again, the limbic anatomy will help overlay that with additional emotion. Okay. Number 3, your nose. Okay, we mentioned we're in a 4D scary theater and they're injecting a perfume of odor. Okay, a perfume of rotting flesh. So your nose, which again is the anatomy of the special senses, delivers information from the nasal cavity to the brain. And smell information is also processed, at least in part, in the temporal lobe. So vision information processed in the occipital lobe, auditory sound information and smell information processed in the temporal lobe. And that information is going to be communicated via the olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve 1. Okay, so, you know, we're talking about some big ideas here. Certainly, you know where your eyes are, and you're aware because of your time in lab about these special nerves. Okay, so let's wrap up the input part of our conversation here. Next, okay, we got to talk about this puff of air business. Now, if you think about it, I indicated in our notes that you're getting puffs of cold air on the back of your neck. So there's 2 aspects to the air. There's the fact that you're feeling the air move across your skin and the fact that it's cold. So that's going to engage different sensory receptors in your skin. All right. So, okay, I'll say it this way. Okay. You know, from our time studying the integumentary system in chapter 5, some of the anatomy that we find in your skin, you might remember something called a hair root plexus. A hair root plexus, basically it's a bundle of neurons around hair follicles. So when the puff of cold air being ejected by the nozzle on your theater chair comes out, and you gently move the hair follicle, the physical motion of the hair follicle is going to generate a graded potential in the neuron that's part of the hair root plexus. That's going to summate to an action potential, which will then move on into your spinal cord, up your brain stem, and into your brain for processing. Okay, so air moves across your skin, hair follicles, and gently moves the hair. This activates neurons associated with hair root plexuses, okay, embedded in your skin, and you become aware through higher order processing in the rational part of your brain that air is blowing across your skin. Okay. Now, that covers the air motion, where we're activating neurons associated with hair root plexuses. Okay. The other aspect of the air is that it was intentionally cold air. It wasn't warm, comfortable air. It was cold air, right? So that means you're also going to activate thermoreceptors, which are going to be different neurons embedded in your skin. And those different neurons will send sensory information again into the higher regions of the brain, where you will rationally conclude, oh, that's chilly air, that's cold air, right? Thermoreceptors detect a change in air temperature as puffs of air are pushed onto your body, and your brain becomes aware of the coldness of that air. Okay, so these thermoreceptors technically are going to be sensory neurons that are part of your general senses. Okay, and the hair root plexuses as well are going to be part of your general senses. Okay, so if you think about eyesight, hearing, smell, those sorts of things, those are part of the special senses. When we're talking about things at the surface of your skin, such as vibration, pressure, motion of hair fibers, temperature changes, those are considered general senses. Okay, folks, any questions right now? All right. I mean, if you want to tell someone how to take the enjoyment out of a 4D scary movie, tell them to take an anatomy and physiology course, right? Because we're actually going to try to explain why you're enjoying that 4D movie, okay? So let's continue here. So we've got the input part of our 4D movie fairly well covered. And I have been alluding to some of the processing that goes on to help form a story for you. I need to give you a little bit more formal notes on these things. Okay, so we have the input coming in from the various sensory neurons, eyes, ears, so on and so forth. Okay, now we need to have a discussion about this idea of integration. Okay, so integration is basically what I was alluding to when there's a conversation between the occipital lobe and the anatomy of the limbic system, which overlays the emotion and memory. Okay, that would be an example of integration. So integration, notice that the sensory nervous system, that's going to involve, right, the peripheral nervous system anatomy. Peripheral nervous system anatomy picks up the stimulus, sends it into the spinal cord and brain. Okay, so we have integration. This is going to be carried out by the central nervous system. Okay, and I'll say some things here that I've been saying all along. Okay, so so number one under integration is that, remember, we have networks of neurons that communicate with each other through intermediary cells called interneurons, right? So the optic nerve is going to have axonal fibers from neurons, but then they're going to synaptically connect with other neurons at the optic chiasm, at the hypothalamus. There's going to be additional connecting neurons that then go up the indusium griseum, other interneurons that go back to the occipital lobe. Okay, so there's going to be this network of connectedness. Networks of neurons communicate with each other through interneurons, which act as bridges between one region of the central nervous system and another. Okay, so this is what's going to allow the logical realization that you're looking at Frankenstein to be associated with some sort of memory and emotional response from the activity of neurons in the limbic system anatomy. Okay, number 2, the purpose of integration is to process the stimuli that you're experiencing so you can perceive the stimulus and then communicate the realization of what that stimulus is to a memory and emotional responses. Okay, and then ultimately, if this was truly a fearful situation, one of your responses might be run away. So you're going to have additional integration where the logical realization that Frankenstein's coming to you, the emotional intensity from the limbic system is overlaid with that. That's going to produce the fear. And then from that, there's going to be interneuron connections that go up to the post-central and pre-central gyruses of the brain, which then coordinate your skeletal muscles to get the heck out of Dodge and move away. Okay. The purpose of integration is to process stimuli so you can logically understand the stimulus, overlay the logical conclusion of the stimulus with emotions and memory, that would be limbic system, and potentially respond by activating motor neurons to run away. Okay. So, even in a piece of wonderful software like Visible Body, which does an amazing job of revealing the depth of the anatomy of your body, we don't quite have the resolution yet we need in medical science to truly understand all the pathways of interneuron connectedness in the brains. Those are the topics of major research projects around the world, and maybe someday we'll have something more meaningful that we can share with each other. But right now, a lot of that is still a mystery. Okay. All right. So as we've said here, so integration is all about connecting the information of the stimulus to various regions of the brain that are going to communicate with each other to have a logical decision about what the stimulus is, to decide what I should remember about that stimulus from past events and overlay it with emotion, and generate a plan of action, probably in the case of fear, to try to defend ourselves, to fight, or to get out of there, flee. Okay. And so part of the integration is going to be interneurons that connect back to the hypothalamus, which is the central linkage, if you will, again, connecting the nervous system to the endocrine system. Okay. The master command and control center, linking the nervous system to the endocrine system, is the hypothalamus. Okay. And by the way, gang, simply because writing my notes reminded me of something, I want to tell you that later today, I will be releasing your study guide for your final exam. So later today, look for your study guide for lecture exam 3, which is the final exam on Wiley Plus. It will be posted later this afternoon, okay? All right, so the master command and control center linking the nervous system to the endocrine system is the hypothalamus. Okay, and so now what we're going to start talking about is some of these responses that are happening because the brain has integrated information, okay? So the third aspect of our conversation here is the output. How's your nervous system going to respond? Okay. Do you have any questions right now? So the output, so let's think about it. The input involves the peripheral nervous system. The integration, the rational awareness of the stimulus overlaid with emotion and memory and developing a plan to respond, is the central nervous system. The output, the execution of a response, is once again the peripheral nervous system. And if I'm being 100% frank with you, we're talking about nervous system topics right here in chapters 12, 15, and 16. That's how we end our semester in AMP1. The output is definitely going to involve the peripheral nervous system, but some of that output's going to involve peripheral nervous system activating the endocrine system, okay? So you might find me dabbling just a little bit in some hormonal conversation here with you. Okay, so from our own table up here that you helped me form, we have a laundry list of different responses that might happen, right? And so I can't possibly discuss every one of them with the time we have available, but what I'm going to do is choose a couple of them and show you how the nervous system is involved in making these responses a reality during the output stage of fight or flight response, okay? Okay, so output, okay? And so, I am highlighting in this conversation, I'm highlighting the hypothalamus as our master command and control center. And so I'm going to start the output response by talking about what's going to happen from the hypothalamus perspective, okay? So the hypothalamus, from your time learning the anatomy, if you unwrap the outer layer of the hypothalamus, you have various nuclei, groups of neuronal cell bodies in there. Some of those nuclei will transmit information deeper into the brain, but some of those nuclei will have axonal fibers that go down into the spinal cord and out into the periphery and activate other things, okay? So we will do it this way. Within the peripheral nervous system, I will mention this. We will talk about it this way. Response number one. Response number one. The hypothalamus responds. The hypothalamus responds to the result of the brain's integration by, okay, here we go, sending nerve impulses down axons that are part of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so this is going to take us to, excuse me a second here, while I get my information organized. Well, let's see here. I think I have a piece of information wrong in my notes. Okay. Basically, the sympathetic division is highlighted in figure 15.2. Figure 15.2. Okay, so I'll draw your attention to that. The hypothalamus responds by sending nerve impulses down axons that are part of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so I'll reference figure 15.2. Okay, let's continue here. Okay, all right. So let me get situated here. Yes, okay. So figure 15.2 is something you want to be aware of. We're going to be looking at that. And we're also going to be looking at figure 15.1 a little bit as part of our conversation here. Okay. So let me ask you a question. Hold on a second. Okay, here we go. So I need you to look very carefully at something for me. So take a look at figure 15.2 and stare at it. Here's my question coming in the chat window. Here we go. Here we go. What is the number of the vertebra in figure 15.2 from which an axon leaves the spinal cord and travels to the suprarenal gland? Suprarenal gland is your adrenal gland. What is the number of the vertebra that axon exits from and attaches to the adrenal gland? Can you identify it? So it'll take a little bit of work, folks. Figure 15.2. Okay. Let me say it one more time. What is the number of the vertebra, right? They're numbered, C1 through C8, T1 through T12, L1 through L5, S1 through S5. What is the number of the vertebra where you see a blue axonal fiber leaving the spinal cord and moving to the suprarenal gland? Okay, we have one response. I'd like to get 2 more responses. I'm going to wait until I get 2 more responses. Okay. Okay. So Noah and Karen, notice that you disagree with each other. So that means one of you is probably off there, right? Okay. All right. So I got 3 responses and I thank you. And so what I'm going to do is focus your attention on T10. Okay. T10 would be the best answer in this case. So once again, stare at T10 in figure 15.2. Stare at T10 and trace your eyes along that axonal fiber. You notice it does branch there a little bit, but stay on the lower branch, wrap it through the celiac ganglion. At the celiac ganglion, take the top branch and move it down to the suprarenal gland, okay? So T10 is where it's at for this conversation. And thank you for doing that. And let me say to you, as a population of students at this point, is that you're going to have to do some of that kind of detective work to prepare to properly answer questions on your final exam. Okay, so let's continue here. And so you can see that while it's tedious, it is achievable. You can, in fact, do this. So response number one, the hypothalamus sends nerve impulses down axons that are part of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. This is highlighted in figure 15.2. In figure 15.2, what we see is the following. Axons leave the spinal cord at thoracic vertebra T10. Okay, and once again, we can see that in figure 15.2, where they synapse with the adrenal gland, but I need to go a little bit more detailed here, okay? They synapse with a special type of cell in the adrenal gland called chromaffin cells, and for that, I will refer you to figure 15.1. Okay, so folks, in figure 15.1, I want you to answer this question in the chat window. Here we go. In figure 15.1, do you see the chromaffin cell term as part of panel A or panel B? Part of panel A or panel B? Okay. Thank you, Shay, for participating. I'm going to wait for a few more. Okay. All right. So thanks, Karen. And thank you, Noah. And Layla, thank you. I really appreciate participation. And what I'm trying to do is slow down enough so that you can focus on this, because you need to focus on it, right? This is hard stuff and you need to slow down and focus. So what we're saying is that one of the responses to the fear from Frankenstein is that there's going to be a nerve impulse sent down an axon that leaves the spinal column at vertebra T10, and it goes out along and connects to cells that are part of the adrenal gland called the chromaffin cells. And that's what we're seeing right here. Okay, so I'm going to continue my notes. So letter B, axons leave the spinal cord at thoracic vertebra T10, where they synapse with chromaffin cells embedded in the adrenal medulla. Okay, this is the suprarenal gland, same thing, of the adrenal gland, located on top of your kidneys, right? Located on top of your kidneys. Then what we can see here, from figure 15.1 is that when the chromaffin cells are stimulated, they release acetylcholine, don't they? You see acetylcholine in figure 15.1. So the chromaffin cells, excuse me, I'm sorry, I misspoke. When the neurons reach the chromaffin cells, the neurons release acetylcholine, which then float across to the chromaffin cells and stimulate them to release two hormones that you know of, called epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're chemical cousins. They're basically slightly different versions of adrenaline, okay? So the axon releases acetylcholine at the synapse between the axon and the chromaffin cells. Okay, so remember, so far in the course, we've talked about the neuromuscular junction. Well, this is a neuroglandular junction, right? This is a neuroglandular junction. So the axon releases acetylcholine at the synapse between the axon and the chromaffin cells, which causes the chromaffin cells, I know I'm out of time here, we're going to have to break, to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Into the bloodstream. Okay, so hopefully, we're going to take a break here, folks. Hopefully, you're now seeing the connectedness between what the nervous system does and what the endocrine system does, right? The hypothalamus is the brain structure that sends an executive order to the adrenal gland to release the adrenaline into the bloodstream. It travels down the spinal cord, exits at vertebra T10, it synapses in the adrenal gland where acetylcholine is released, which activates the chromaffin cells to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. So I'm just going to highlight some of these special words in your notes as things that you're going to want to pay attention to during your private study time. Okay? Okay, folks, I know this is getting a little long and we should probably take a break. So by my clock, it's about 9:17. Let's take a break until 9:35. Let's take a break till 9:35. Then we're going to come back and we're going to continue because I need to finish this topic so that we can start a new chapter next week, okay? So take a break. I'll see you at 9:35 and we'll finish this topic. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Okay, so we're going to continue our conversation in chapter 15. Hope you had a chance to get a little snack or something and refresh yourself. I'm hoping that we can finish our conversation here in about 30 or 40 minutes. So let's get down to it. Do you have any questions right now? Right, we're covering a lot of ground here and there's a lot of new content. Is there anything you'd like to ask? Okay, everybody's quiet, so I hope you're okay. It's one of these things where you know, when you read through chapter 15 the first time, it's like, whoa, it's just overwhelming with detail, isn't it? So let's go back to our notes. Okay, we were talking about the output, the response for being afraid in our 4D scary movie because Frankenstein's coming towards us and we hear a wolf howling and all that kind of good stuff, okay? So let me just re-summarize what we're talking about, right? You're going to get nerve impulses streaming out of the hypothalamus because the hypothalamus is sort of the central link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So there's going to be nerve impulses that leave the hypothalamus, go down the spinal cord, as you've seen in figure 15.2, exit the spinal cord at thoracic vertebra T10. It will synapse with chromaffin cells that are part of your adrenal gland. In that synapse, the axon, the neuron, is going to release acetylcholine, which then activates it, depolarizes the chromaffin cells so that they dump epinephrine and norepinephrine, basically adrenaline, into the blood, into the bloodstream. Okay. All right, so that's where we are. Now, you can probably guess what's going to happen next because we kind of have some familiarity. I find students have some familiarity with the idea of adrenaline. Okay, so your body responds to these hormones, okay, epinephrine and norepinephrine, by increasing heart rate. Okay, so if you increase your heart rate, you're going to pump up your blood pressure. You're going to be ready for action. And converting glycogen back into glucose, which pumps up the glucose level in the blood supply. Okay, so your body responds to epinephrine and norepinephrine by increasing heart rate and converting glycogen back to glucose to increase blood glucose levels. This is all as part of the response to prepare for conflict or to prepare to escape from that conflict, right? You're either going to stand your ground and fight Frankenstein, or you're going to run screaming out of the theater, okay? Now, I will also mention to you, just as a side note, that, the story with the body always gets more complicated, okay? And I'm not going to hold you responsible for the next note, but I'm going to tell you the next note anyway, okay? So please understand that your heart rate and the force of muscle contraction in the heart are heavily influenced by these endocrine signals that are being released from the adrenal gland, okay? So the heart is massively influenced by the adrenaline, but it is also influenced by alternative nerve fibers that right now have not been part of our conversation. Okay, so the heart is going to be influenced by the adrenaline that was released in our conversation, and we've documented it. And there's also other nerve fibers that we have not talked about, and which I will not hold you responsible for, which can also influence heart rate and the force of heart muscle contraction. Okay, so let me get this into your notes. Heart rate and the force of heart muscle contraction are heavily influenced by endocrine signals and also by independent electrical stimulation of the heart via the superior, middle, and inferior cervical ganglia. Okay, the superior, middle, and inferior cervical ganglia. Okay. Okay. So I'm not going to hold you responsible for that, folks. I just wanted you to be aware of just how complicated this story really is. If you look at figure 15.2, look at the brain, slowly glance your eyes down towards the cervical region of your spinal cord, then go to the right gently with your eyes, and do you see superior cervical ganglion, middle cervical ganglion, inferior cervical ganglion? Okay, so that's what I'm talking about in these notes that I'm giving you. Okay, folks, that is response number one. Your hypothalamus receives instructions from the higher order brain, which has processed Frankenstein, given an emotional response to Frankenstein as fear, and then interneurons communicate to the hypothalamus and say, we got to respond, fight or flight. We got to respond, fight or flight. Hypothalamus sends nerve impulses down the spinal cord, out T10, which synapse with chromaffin cells in the adrenal gland. they dump adrenaline into the bloodstream, your heart responds. Okay, that's response 1. Okay, any questions? Okay, so there's many things we could talk about in terms of responses, right? We've created a huge list up here at the start of our notes. I can't talk about all of them. I'm going to talk about one more, and then I'm going to move on. Okay. So response number 2. Response number 2. So at the same time, I mean, for all practical purposes, simultaneously with response 1, we're going to have response 2. So simultaneously, the hypothalamus also responds by, okay, so your heart rate is going up because your hypothalamus told the adrenal gland to dump adrenaline into the bloodstream. Okay, and let me see here. Okay, so response 2, the hypothalamus will send nerve impulses down different neurons. Different neurons that are also part of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so that's all still part of our conversation. Sending nerve impulses down different neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, because sympathetic is fight or flight, right? That eventually synapse with the superior cervical ganglion. That's what I drew your eyes to just a moment ago in figure 15.2. Okay. And it's in the superior cervical ganglion that the presynaptic neuron is going to release acetylcholine, and that will stimulate postganglionic neurons that continue to signal outward to target organs. Okay. Presynaptic neurons synapse release acetylcholine and activate postsynaptic neurons that continue to transmit information to other anatomy of the body. Okay, so just take a look at the superior cervical ganglion here. That's part of our conversation, right? Okay, the postganglionic neurons will communicate by so I'm moving from the superior cervical ganglion up towards your head there. So take a look at the head region of figure 15.2. Okay, so notice that everything in the head is going to be activated by postsynaptic neurons coming out of the superior cervical ganglion, and those postsynaptic neurons innervate many things, right? They innervate the pineal gland, the lacrimal gland, the mucous membranes of the nose and palate, the parotid glands, the sublingual and submandibular glands. Lots of things we could talk about there. I'm going to choose to focus on the salivary glands, okay, as one example of an additional response to fight or flight. So postganglionic neurons communicate by releasing norepinephrine to the arterioles. Okay, so remember, arterioles are tiny blood vessels contained within the salivary glands. Okay, so remember, salivary glands are parotid glands, sublingual and submandibular. So when the postganglionic neuron synapses with the arterial, it releases norepinephrine. The arterial constricts, it tightens up, okay, it narrows. And the outcome of narrowing the arterial is that you slow the blood supply into the salivary glands. Since saliva is nothing more than any other body fluid, where we've said every body fluid is simply a version of filtered blood plasma. When the postganglionic neuron causes the arterioles to constrict, we reduce blood flow into the salivary gland, so we slow the rate of saliva production. This is what is going to give you the dry mouth sensation when you're scared. The arterioles constrict, reducing blood flow to the salivary glands, and we experience dry mouth. Okay? So the sensation of dry mouth is because your salivary glands cannot form saliva. Why can't they form saliva? Because there's not enough blood in the salivary gland. Why isn't there enough blood there? Because the blood vessel carrying the blood, the arterioles, have narrowed, they have constricted. Why did they constrict? Because they're responding to norepinephrine. Where did norepinephrine come from? It came from the neuron that synapsed with the blood vessel. Okay. All right. Okay, folks. So I know this is pretty intense, but any questions right now? Okay, so what we have done now is document 2 possible responses and tried to trace out the nervous system anatomy and its relationship to the response of glandular tissue in the adrenal gland, or glandular tissue in the mouth and throat region for the salivary glands, of things that you might experience when you are scared. So we've traced out 2 responses. So I'm not going to do any more of that kind of thing, but now we need to talk about, well, okay, after we leave the movie theater and we realize that Frankenstein's not real and we're not being exposed to intense sounds of wolves, our body's got to calm down. What's going to happen when we calm down? Okay, so we need to talk about this a little bit. After the danger or threat has passed, we now have to engage in rest and digest. Okay, so if you think about it, the sympathetic nervous system, the responses that we documented in your notes, took place because sensory information was ultimately fed into your brain processed it, added on a layer of emotional response, and decided on a plan of action, so it communicated to the hypothalamus to cause the rest of the body to respond, such as triggering an increase in heart rate because of adrenaline being released, having dry mouth in the mouth because there's no saliva getting produced. So we have to turn these things off. We have to step it back. Rest and digest. For rest and digest, The hypothalamus is also going to be involved here, but the hypothalamus is going to be involved using nerve fibers that are now part of the parasympathetic division of the nervous system, not the sympathetic, right? So figure 15.2 is the sympathetic nervous system. Fight or flight, figure 15.2, fight or flight. Figure 15.3, rest or digest. Figure 15.3, rest or digest. Okay, so I'm going to do this. Response number 3. Okay, so we have 2 responses earlier in our notes, which are about fight or flight. I'm now going to document 2 responses that are part of rest and digest. Okay, response number 3. The hypothalamus sends nerve impulses down axons that are part of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. And so we're going to take a look at some of these ideas here. So as we look at figure 15.3, I'll again ask you to turn your eyes to some things. So axons are going to leave the brainstem. Axons are going to leave the brainstem a little bit above cervical vertebrae C1 as part of your facial nerve. Okay, can you identify facial nerve? Can you identify facial nerve as part of figure 15.3? It's basically going to be part of your brainstem around the pons, if you're familiar with that. So identify the facial nerve there. Axons leave the brainstem above cervical vertebrae C1 as part of the facial nerve. Okay, that's great. Facial nerve is cranial nerve 7. And these neurons synapse with other cell bodies that are in the submandibular ganglion. Okay, can you identify the submandibular ganglion in figure 15.3? Okay. So I'm continuing my notes here, and synapse with other neurons that are part of the submandibular ganglion. Submandibular ganglion. Okay. So continuing our story here, within the submandibular ganglion, parasympathetic preganglionic neurons will release acetylcholine. You notice how we keep talking about acetylcholine here, right? Who knew, right? We were talking about acetylcholine with the skeletal muscle. Who knew that acetylcholine was so heavily involved in triggering endocrine tissue responses? Okay, so once again, within the submandibular ganglion, parasympathetic preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, which activates parasympathetic postganglionic neurons, to release additional acetylcholine, which causes, excuse me, to release additional acetylcholine, which causes the arterioles in the salivary glands to dilate, to to open up and widen, restoring the flow of blood to the salivary gland so we can filter that blood and produce more saliva. So we relieve our dry mouth situation. Okay, within the submandibular ganglion, parasympathetic preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, which activates parasympathetic postganglionic neurons to release acetylcholine, which causes the arterioles in the salivary glands to dilate. So they open up. Okay, so this restores blood flow to the salivary gland and increases saliva production. So dry mouth is relieved. Okay, dry mouth is relieved. Okay. Take a look here. Take a look at something. In response to as part of fight or flight, where we were going to develop dry mouth, the arterioles constricted because of the presence of norepinephrine. Norepinephrine caused the arterioles to constrict. But in the rest and digest process, it's going to be acetylcholine, which causes the arterioles to dilate, to do the exact opposite thing. Okay? All right, folks. Any questions? Hang in there. One more response, then we're going to leave this topic, talk about a few other side bits in chapter 15, and we'll put it to rest for today, okay? So, response 4. Response 4. Okay, so response 4, at the same time that response 3 is happening, there are going to be nerve impulses sent down the spinal cord and out to the vagus nerve. Okay, so identify the vagus nerve on figure 15.3, the vagus nerve on figure 15.3. Okay. So simultaneously with response 3, other nerve impulses will be sent down the vagus nerve where acetylcholine is released to communicate with the heart. Okay, just trace the vagus nerve from your brain stem to the heart. Trace the vagus nerve from the brain stem to the heart. Okay, so you can see a very powerful connection of a branch of the vagus nerve with your heart. The vagus nerve is going to synapse with heart muscle fibers, release acetylcholine, and in this context of the parasympathetic system, the release of acetylcholine is not going to excite the heart, it's actually going to slow the heart. And the reason for that is because, again, there are different receptors in different parts of your body that can bind to the same hormone that respond differently to the same hormone. So in skeletal muscle, when you provide acetylcholine, you're going to activate muscle contraction. But in parasympathetic nerve fibers that release acetylcholine into specific regions of heart anatomy, because there's different receptors in those regions, those different receptors will respond to the acetylcholine by actually slowing the heart rate down and reducing the force of contraction. Okay, so once again, in your notes, response 4, simultaneously with response 3, other nerve impulses will be sent down the vagus nerve, where acetylcholine is released to communicate with the heart, to slow heart rate and reduce the force of heart muscle contraction. So basically, folks, what I've done here with the parasympathetic responses is counteract the responses we described during fight or flight. Okay. Okay, gang. So, those are two simple, quote unquote, tongue in cheek examples of how the autonomic nervous system is regulating first fight or flight through the sympathetic nerve fibers, and then rest and digest through the parasympathetic nerve fibers. Okay. Are there any questions you would like to ask? Other than, why do I have to go through this hell? Okay. All right. Well, I suspect we have to go through this hell because somewhere along the line, we need somebody to be able to do something meaningful in the hospital. Okay. Okay. So one more small piece of the puzzle here that I want to get in your notes, and then we're going to let it rest. Okay. And so what I would like to talk about is neurotransmitters and receptors. Neurotransmitters and receptors, which is section 15.3 in your textbook, section 15.3. And within that section, the first figure that I'm seeing in the textbook is figure 15.7, figure 15.7. Okay, so let's just bolt down some important ideas here into your notes. Autonomic nervous system neurotransmitters and receptors. Again, it's section 15.3 in your notes. That's the text of section 15.3. And one of the figures there is figure 15.7. Okay. Okay, so some talking points about this content. Number one, we remember, and again, forgive me for saying things repeatedly, but I do find there's value in repetition because it helps it stick, and you might get sick of it, but at least you remember it, okay? So remember, the same neurotransmitter can create different responses in different locations of the body because there are different receptors in those different locations. Okay, so the same neurotransmitter can elicit different responses in different locations of the body because there are different receptors in different target organs. Okay, so now we need to talk about two major categories of receptors. So I would turn your attention to both figure 15.7 and table 15.2. This will be the information that you'll need to process during your private study time. So these are different categories or classifications of autonomic nervous system receptors. And of course, your book is going to give you the full story on this. I'm only going to make some points. Okay. Cholinergic receptors, which you see as the top type of receptor category in table 15.2. Cholinergic receptors release acetylcholine, which then diffuses to target organs. Okay. Now, cholinergic receptors come in two sub-varieties, and we're going to document these things. So the subtypes of cholinergic receptors include nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors are a type of cholinergic receptor. So nicotinic receptors, excuse me, I wrote something wrong in your notes here. Cholinergic receptors bind acetylcholine. They don't release acetylcholine. Cholinergic receptors bind acetylcholine, which then diffuses to, I'm sorry, I bungled that up in my notes here. Let me get this written out properly for you. Cholinergic neurons release acetylcholine, which then diffuses to target receptors. Okay. So we now have the receptor subtypes. Okay, nicotinic receptors, obviously they are going to bind the acetylcholine. Nicotinic receptors are named nicotinic receptors because nicotine as a molecule, as a chemical, as a drug, can also bind these same receptors. So nicotinic receptors are capable of binding acetylcholine, and they're also capable of binding the molecule nicotine. Okay. Okay, so that might seem kind of an odd thing to you, but you have to realize when science is trying to figure something out, one of the things you do when you're trying to figure out what a receptor binds to is you throw different chemicals at it randomly and see what sticks. And apparently during the research of these receptors, scientists discovered that nicotine binds these receptors. In fact, scientists discovered that nicotine binds these receptors before they found that acetylcholine binds these receptors. And so that's why they're called nicotine receptors. It's kind of a nuance of the human process of doing scientific research, okay? So nicotinic receptors are capable of binding nicotine and acetylcholine, okay? All right, so let's tell you a little bit more here. Nicotinic receptors are commonly found at the neuromuscular junction. That should be no surprise now. They're commonly found at neuromuscular junctions. They're also found at chromaffin cells, which we just introduced you to today. And many other places of the body that, you know, it would be a long list to write them all out. So nicotinic receptors are a subclassification of cholinergic receptors. And they are found at the neuromuscular junction and in the chromaffin cells. Okay, so we didn't say that today when we were talking about it because we had enough on our plate. All right, so a second subtype of cholinergic receptor is the muscarinic receptor. Well, let me see. There's one more thing I want to say here. Okay. The second thing that we should mention in the nicotinic receptors is that when you activate a nicotinic receptor with acetylcholine, it will cause depolarization and excitation of the postsynaptic cell. Okay, that is a very important piece of information to have in your memory banks. Okay, activation of nicotinic receptors leads to depolarization and subsequent excitation of the postsynaptic cell. Okay, all right. So a second type of cholinergic receptor is the muscarinic receptor. That's going to be letter B here. Muscarinic receptors are named muscarinic receptors because muscarine is a chemical that actually comes from mushrooms. It's actually a type of poison to many other cells, like microbial cells. Okay, and so this molecule also binds these receptors just like acetylcholine does as well. Okay, so muscarinic receptors are named because of the mushroom poison called muscarine that can compete with acetylcholine binding to these receptors. Okay, so muscarinic receptors are commonly found in smooth muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and glandular tissue. All right. Now, we just got done saying that when you activate a nicotinic receptor, it always leads to depolarization and subsequent excitation. That is always true. With muscarinic receptors, there's a bit more nuance. Okay, there are actually subtypes of the muscarinic receptors that your book is not telling you about. And so based on the subtype of muscarinic receptor, when you activate these receptors, you can create, depending on the subtype of receptor present, you can create a depolarizing effect which will excite the target cell, or depending on different receptors, different subtypes, you can hyperpolarize the cell, which will inhibit the target cell. Okay, so I will document this in your notes a little bit differently. There are at least 5 known muscarinic receptor subtypes. Okay, some subtypes cause the target cell to depolarize, which means to excite, while others will hyperpolarize, which inhibits. Okay. All right. It's also important that you appreciate that nicotine and muscarine are not capable of activating each other's receptors. They're not capable of doing that. Okay, so muscarine will not bind a nicotinic receptor, and nicotine will not bind a muscarinic receptor. They're not chemically compatible. Okay. So, questions, things I can try to help clarify for you. Are the things you're confused about right now? Okay, one more thing, and then we're done, okay? So we documented the cholinergic neurons that release acetylcholine, and then there are receptors, cholinergic receptors, that bind that acetylcholine. Those receptors are nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. We also have other categories of neurons which release basically adrenaline, and then we have receptors that will bind that adrenaline. Okay, so these are the adrenergic neurons of table 15.2. Adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine. And truth be told, they also release other categories of neurotransmitters as well, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Okay. And so the receptor subtypes here include the following. Alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. I'm not going to list them all out and define them for you because of our time situation, but I'm going to mention a couple things. Alpha, the alpha subtypes, okay. Activation of the alpha subtypes depends which subtype you're dealing with and what the target organ is as to how the cell will respond, okay? So let me put it this way. So the receptor subtypes are alpha, which include alpha 1 and alpha 2. And beta, which includes beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. You can see that in table 15.2. All right. And so let me make this statement here. Generally speaking, activation of alpha 1 and beta 1 receptors leads to depolarization and excitation. Generally speaking, activation of alpha 2 and beta 2 receptors leads to hyperpolarization and subsequent inhibition of the target cell. Okay. All right, folks. I think we're getting long in the tooth here, and we're probably half passed out on the floor at this point. So I think I'm going to call it quits for our chapter 15 note taking at this time. But, you know, once you have a chance to take a break and really rest, you know, I'm trying to highlight things that I really want you to think about during your private study time. And you'll see when you take a look at the study guide for your final exam that I have in fact highlighted several topics that you're going to be challenged with on your final exam, okay? So one more time before we call it quits to this, are there any topics you would like to ask about that we've covered here for chapter 15? Okay. The challenging point is like anything, if I simply list out all the detailed facts of chapter 15, then basically you're memorizing an almanac, right? And while some of that has to occur, it's much more important that you connect some of the facts to the physiology, so you understand why things are working the way they work. And whether I've been successful or not, that was my ultimate goal in trying to walk you through the responses of being scared at a 4D movie experience, okay? So any questions? All right, so that's 6 pages of notes we took today, folks. Wow, I'm tired. I'm sure you're tired too. Let's put that away and transition our brains to lab. Okay, let's transition to lab. So I'm going to stop the recording.